So we're running a little bit behind, so I'm gonna move us along as quickly as I can. Our next session is a discussion back in the sort of public policy space about workers' rights, and we have three guests to join us. Our director, Erik Brynjolfsson, will be coming back to the stage, as well as Tom Koken, who is the George and Maverick Bunker Professor of Management, a professor of work and employment research and engineering systems, and the co-director of the MIT Sloan Institute for Work and Employment Research at Sloan. And our distinguished guest for this session, all the way from California's 17th Congressional District, is Congressman Khanna. Representative Khanna sits on the House Budget and Armed Services Committees and is the vice chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. So please join me in welcoming our final panel of the day.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, Congressman Khanna. We're the cleanup act for this session. It's been a wonderful day, a lot of good discussion, and we'll keep it going here. I apologize for my throat. I'm in the final stages of a cold.
Do you need some water?
I've got it here.
Okay.
Got it here. So I've decided that the cold is just about ready to leave. But we're delighted to have you here.
Yes. Welcome.
First of all, congratulations on your re-election by 72%. So that's
a nail biter.
An endorsement of Silicon Valley and your constituents and the good people of California. And we should take a moment to extend our condolences to all the people in California for the tragedy that unfortunately occurred again last night with more loss of life, something that is an issue we all care about and we need to work on. So. That's in our thoughts at the moment as well. But we're here to talk about all of the interesting issues that you're addressing as a congressman right in the heart of Silicon Valley, as an expert in technology, as a college professor who has studied law and economics and has really focused on the workforce. And one of the things that impresses me very much as I look at what you've done is you are a strong believer in the value of technology and an equally strong advocate for making sure the benefits are spread more broadly in society. And I think that's something that I think is so badly needed in the economy and our politics today, and we appreciate your leadership. So we're just looking forward to having a good discussion with you and Erik this afternoon. And I'd like to just get started by asking you a little bit about this interesting concept of a Bill of Rights in high tech and the internet that you have authored and put together. Tell us a little bit about what your broader vision is for the use of high technology and the work that's going on in your district to achieve a more broadly shared prosperity, and where this Bill of Rights fits in.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here and for your work and leadership. It's an honor to be here at MIT. I told my colleagues I hope to return a little bit smarter for my time here. I won't embarrass Erik, but I was a lecturer at Stanford, and I used to assign his book, Race Against Machine,
cool.
and tell folks it's the most important book, one of the most important books written in the last 10 years. So I appreciate your being on the panel. The Internet Bill of Rights stemmed. Nancy Pelosi and I had a conversation after Mark Zuckerberg's testimony in Congress. I don't know how many people saw that testimony here. I think most people came in watching thinking we really need to hold Facebook accountable. And then they saw some of the questions that senators and congresspeople were asking. And they said, those are the people writing the rules? You had senators asking, how does Facebook make money? Asking, I never heard congresspeople saying to Zuckerberg, well, tell us how we should regulate you. And so Nancy said, look, we need to have some principles that will help guide us. And I reached out to Tim Berners-Lee and a number of other technologists, and we came up with 10 principles to at least start the conversation. I'm not going to go through all 10, but a few of them are the right to know your data when you are online. So we know if you go to a doctor's office, you get to figure out what your healthcare records are, and you have access to that. If you want to know your credit reports, you can do that. The same should be true if you're online. The right to have consent, not opt-out, but opt-in consent, but before your data is collected. And here we didn't say for every use case, but at the initial collection, you should have to give consent. Third point, and then we can, I'd love to get Erik's thoughts, is the right to be notified in a timely manner. If that was there, we would have known about the Cambridge Analytica breach long before the 2016 election, and people could have at least made an informed decision. But a lot of these cases, the leadership of companies have known about the breach, and they haven't informed the public.
Well, I like the emphasis on transparency and information. That's a source of influence, source of power, and it lets people make their own choices. So I think that, and we're going to see that. We'll maybe talk a little bit about some other developments in high tech along those lines. But Erik, you've been working on these issues for a long time. You have thoughts about the Bill of Rights.
First off, let me add my compliments. I'm so glad people like you are in Congress. There aren't nearly enough people who understand technology and science. We have a lot more talk show hosts than scientists and economists in Congress, and that's not a good thing. And so I'm glad that you are there thinking carefully about this and talking to people like Tim Berners-Lee. So that's a great step. And I think this Internet Bill of Rights is a good example of a thoughtful approach towards these issues. I very much agree with the data transparency issues and the privacy things you have in there. One thing you didn't mention that I also am a big fan of is the data portability. I think that some of the big companies, this morning we spoke with Eric Schmidt about network effects and the monopolies that can create. One thing you can do, other than breaking them up, which I think is very difficult, is make it easier for customers to take their data and move it elsewhere and be portable so you don't get as much lock-in. And then ultimately you get more competition. I think there was also something in the Bill of Rights about trying to have multiple providers. I think those are the kind of pro-competitive movements that I think will help consumers have more choice and also lead to a more dynamic economy. We heard in the last panel that there isn't as much dynamism as there could be. So I'm glad you're doing that. And one other thing I should say is sometimes people think of let's not have the government get involved. But the thing to remember is that, the government, we all are setting the rules of the game all along. I mean, intellectual property is a creation of the government. The right of these companies to have IP, patents, copyright, whatever, is something that the government created and enforces, by law. So certainly, you don't want to have no laws. So you're going to have laws that make it useful and that ultimately, from an economist's perspective, lead to competition and growth. And I think it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and our focus in this discussion is going to now turn to the role of workers and worker rights. And many of us here have emphasized that most of our employment law was built for the 20th century. For the industrial workforce, we got the New Deal in the 1930s, and we're still living with the legacy of that set of legislation, and much of it is still very important and relevant. But a lot of it is outdated, outmoded, and needs to be supplemented with a modern set of legal rights for workers. You've been very active in thinking about this. You have been a co-sponsor of this Bezos Act for making sure that companies would pay the equivalent in taxes for the amount of money that the public is supporting their employees on public assistance. But you've also talked a lot about extending digital opportunities to people in depressed areas. Give us a sense of where you are in this journey to help update worker rights and employment policies to catch up with and lead us in the right direction in the future.
Well, Tom, I appreciate your writing and work on this. Here's my perspective. As we're transitioning into a digital age and software is transforming so many industries, there has been, for the last 40 years, stagnation of wages of the working class, middle class, through every president, by the way. And you've had record profits for those who have been fortunate, either to grow up with computers or figure out a global economy. Now, there are many theories of why that's the case. Let me simply offer 3. The president's theory is it's because of the immigrants and because we're trading. Blame China, blame the folks who've come into the country. I mean, that's basically his theory of the case. That's how he went and won states. He said, I know why your wages are stagnating. It's because of the other. I, of course, reject that. And then I think there are 2 other schools which I fall into. One, to Erik's point, is the rules of the economy. How have we written the actual rules of the economy, and who are those rules benefiting? And you look at things such as stock buybacks and allowing stock buybacks. That was a conscious decision we made, a deregulation in 1982. Before that, stock buybacks weren't as freely allowed. And so people now are investing a lot of that profit back into their stock as opposed to into worker wages. Or you look at rules that around minimum wage. The reality is Bernie Sanders and I, we called for Bezos to raise his wage to $15. And I cited Henry Ford. I said, Henry Ford in 1914 raised wages from $2.50 a day to $5 a day. That was radical back then. I mean, he doubled wages. And the equivalent $5 today of a day would be about $120, which is $15 minimum wage. So Bezos, because of many reasons, raised it to $15. Right. And guess what? The stock went up the next 2 days. It wasn't some huge blow to their company or their profits. That's a decision in terms of our rules. Of course, collective bargaining and how much we make collective bargaining possible, or the role of workers on corporate boards like they have in Germany. Those are all decisions we make about rules. So I would say in the second theory, we need to really think about rules that are going to give employees more stake in a digital economy. And then the third school is that the types of skills and opportunities are changing for the types of jobs that we have. And we aren't really thinking about what we can do to make it possible for people to take advantage in this new economy. Let me give you a very concrete example. I was in Jefferson, Iowa, and you go across rural America, and one of the things people talk about is this brain drain. And I hadn't heard the term before other than from my own parents who came from India talking about a brain drain. But a lot of rural America fears that they can't get a job in the community they grew up in. They don't want to go live in Boston. They don't want to live in Silicon Valley. They want to live in the town where their family is, where their community is. And so the challenge is, how do you offer those folks possibilities? Well, the internet may actually offer a lot of new opportunities. If you have high-speed internet, if you're able to do certain jobs in IT support or advanced manufacturing, you would be able to have jobs and stay in that community. But we need to reimagine what the possibilities are for communities to take advantage in this new economy.
Well, I just want to build on that and then turn to Erik, because this last point hits close to home. I grew up in one of those rural areas, and there were good jobs when I was growing up, good blue-collar manufacturing jobs. They're all gone now, and we see all the social and economic ills that come from it. But there's still that core potential. If we could now invest in the infrastructure to get broadband extended more equitably, and if we could encourage businesses with economic development and perhaps tax policy to invest in those local economies, I think the quality of life in so many of those areas, still the quality of schools is quite good. And we could reinvest and really strengthen our economy and rebuild that part of our society where we have now such a deep division and so much anger that's out there in that part of the world. So I just wanted to make that comment. But Erik, you've thought a lot about this as well. We've talked a lot about policy
I very much
issues.
like your taxonomy of the different ways of diagnosing what's going on. The problem is very evident, what's causing it. There's some debate, and I think you're spot on, and it very much aligns with what I've been writing and the work I did with Andy and what we do with the Initiative on the Digital Economy. But I don't want this to turn into just a love fest. I'm going to pick out the one part out of all the things that I agree with you. I'm going to pick the one part I don't quite understand, and that is the Bezos Act, which isn't, technically Jeff Bezos. It's an acronym. I can't remember what it stands for. But the idea is that government would punish or tax companies that are hiring people who are on public assistance. And that seems to create a very perverse set of incentives. It means that if there's a single mother who is working, that the company would have an incentive to try not to hire that person, instead hire a double income couple, maybe paying them less each. So there's not really an incentive to raise wages. Or if there's a state that has good benefits, like Massachusetts or California or Vermont, you would be motivated to have fewer operations there and more in states with low benefits. It leads to a lot, and just more generally, try to discourage companies from hiring people who need assistance. I think we should be doing kind of just the opposite. We should reward and encourage companies for finding ways to employ people like that, maybe through the earned income tax credit. Absolutely try to get them to raise the wages. I'm glad that you and others helped pressure Bezos or Amazon into raising wages, and we can do that with minimum wages, earned income tax credits. But I think most economists would see that as a better set of incentives rather than discouraging companies from hiring those people.
Well, I would say a couple of things. So on the economic point, the bill, as was written, said that if you're a company that makes over $1 billion and you are paying your employees a wage that is so low that taxpayers are basically subsidizing the food stamps or public housing, you need to raise those wages to $15. If you raise it to $15, then you're exempt. So it's not that you have to pay all the public benefits for tuition scholarship, but if you raise it to $15, you're exempt. Otherwise, you're going to pay for the public benefits. The framing was to partly build a coalition. I think one of the reasons Bezos responded is Tucker Carlson ended up supporting it, and as did Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
And there was,
I don't know if that's something that's in his favor, to tell you the truth.
But the idea was, why is it that these companies that are billions of dollars, why are the taxpayers subsidizing it? Now, I think you need strong anti-discrimination provisions in there. Obviously, you don't want someone discriminating against someone who has benefits or public benefits. And you could, it's like Gary Becker's theory of crime. You could say, we'll throw the corporate executive in jail if they discriminated. So if you made the penalties high enough, you could prevent the discrimination.
I mean, I totally agree with the spirit of what you're trying to do. I don't know many economists who would agree with the particular mechanism that you're doing, and I have no doubt that it appeals to populists on the far left and on the far right. But I don't know that that's where we should be aiming our policy going forward. There are ways of achieving those goals that I think are much more likely to have the right incentives. And ultimately, one of the first lessons of incentives of economics is you want to look at incentives to get people to do the right thing. I think this sets a lot of weird, bizarre incentives like the ones I mentioned. You could add another layers of prosecution and scrutiny on top of that, but I think that path is probably not as effective as having a set of incentives that gets people to try to employ these people in the first place rather than try to make it a disincentive to employ them.
Yeah, so this is a debate that will continue, and in fact, in some respects, the world is moving on with the fight for 15 having such an effect, the $15 an hour minimum wage, companies responding, tight labor markets, but we still do have a lot of employees below that in states that don't have these benefits. So this is improving the living wage, the minimum wage, the basic conditions for low-wage workers has really caught on in this country, and I think it's going to be a major topic. So I think we need to explore a lot of these options. But let's talk to another group, or about another group that's often left out, and that's the significant number of people who are now contract workers or independent contractors. As companies have slimmed down to their core competencies, we're seeing more contracting out, and they're in an ambiguous situation, and then independent contractors are excluded from so much of the legacy of our labor and employment protections. And I know you have thought a lot about this, you have spoken out on it. Where do you see us going on that issue?
Well, it's a huge challenge. The last I had read, most of the job growth, even under the Obama administration, wasn't for independent contractors and non-employees. And I haven't seen the recent data, but my assumption is that that trend has continued. The reason is because all of these companies have learned that you offshore all non-essential services. So you talk to Apple or Google and they'll say, we need to be really good at making iPhones, but we don't need to have janitorial staff, and we don't need to have security guards, and we don't need to have people who are doing administrative services. That's not our core competency. Part of that has made it very difficult, and there was that famous New York Times article comparing Apple and Kodak. It's made it difficult for someone just to start out in the mailroom and rise up. You know, on Capitol Hill, actually, that's still how it works. You can start out as a staff assistant giving people tours, and you can end up as a chief of staff. But in many of the private sector world, now it's not just your benefits and your wages that may be lower, it's calling into question the fundamental social mobility, the economic aspiration that is so critical in our society. And I make that point because it's important to understand, and vis-a-vis our president. The president went to people and communities and said, I'm gonna give you your pride back. It wasn't just about the economics. He said, you built America. I wanna give you those jobs back. And we have to figure out, how do we give people not just $15 minimum wage or others, how do we give them a sense of economic aspiration and mobility in this economy? So I don't have all the answers. I do think, I do have a few thoughts. One, I think we have to have more accountability in bargaining for companies that use subcontractors. So subcontractors, if you're serving food at Facebook, you shouldn't just be able to negotiate with your contractor, you should be able to negotiate with the parent company, especially if that's where your essential work is. And that, I think, can get to some of the wage and benefit questions. But then more broadly, I think because the employer is no longer the place where you're gonna have mentorship and a career trajectory of upward mobility, that places a greater obligation on government, communities, and society to be providing education, to be providing credentialing, to be providing numerous pathways for people to be able to have upward economic mobility, where in the past they could have just worked at the same company for 20 years and had that.
Yeah. Erik, real quick, and then I
sure.
have one
Real
more
quickly,
question.
well, first off, I agree very much with what you're saying. Larry Katz at Harvard helped negotiate an arrangement where the outsourced workers would be paid the same wage as the people working for Harvard for similar jobs, so that took away any incentive to outsource just to cut wages or benefits. But I think the real root issue is this weird artifact we have in the United States where we bundle benefits with the job instead of having the government provide them, which means taxpayers, of course. And that means that it creates a lot of awkwardness about how many hours you work and which company you work for, and they're not portable. In countries like Denmark, they have flex security, where it's easy to hire, fire, work long hours, short hours, whatever. It's a much more flexible economy, but workers don't lose their benefits. They don't lose their health care or pension or other benefits, because that is something that everybody has, that cuts across. It ends up costing less. It ends up leading to a more dynamic, flexible economy. And I know it's a long haul. This is one where I maybe do agree with Bernie Sanders and a lot of other people, although it would be considered standard conservative economics in Europe to have Medicare for all and other policies that would unbundle benefits from being locked into companies. And then whether you're an Uber driver or working for IBM or whoever, you would get that package of benefits.
So we only have a little time left, but I think it is important for us to talk about what's been going on at Google in the last week or so. This is perhaps the employees telling us what kind of new rights they want to have. So Google employees said, we want to end mandatory arbitration for sexual harassment claims. They want to have more transparency and equal pay for equal work for women and men, and for contractors to be included in that. A number of other things of upgrading the role of the diversity officers, and very importantly, putting workers on the board of directors. And I know that's a bill that you've also co-authored in Congress. So here we have employees maybe one step ahead of the rest of us saying, forget labor law as we've inherited it. let's start with a new approach. And I think that's exactly what's needed in today's world. And I'd be interested, since this is right in your neck of the woods, your comments on what you're seeing happening and the response of Google. We understand today Google announced that they are going to end mandatory arbitration, make it optional for sexual harassment claims and some other things. So there's some action in this area. It's exciting.
Right. I think it's a huge step. I think people at Google and other companies have realized their own power. I mean, they are a highly sought after employees, and no company can afford to ignore them. And so there was this demonstration walkout asking for some simple things, having a chief ethics officer with the company, making sure that there's full transparency in terms of sexual harassment claims and people know what's going on publicly, making sure, as you pointed out, that you don't have forced arbitration, that there's voluntary arbitration. And Google, to its credit, seems to have responded on forced arbitration and moving away from that. I know they have some transparency in terms of all the employee claims, but they may be able to provide more specificity to show which ones are sexual harassment and which ones are racially based in more detail. But here's why I'm optimistic that these kind of actions can lead to better outcomes. The people I know in Silicon Valley, obviously there's profit motivated and want to make money, as most people do in the free enterprise system. But most of them genuinely do believe deep down that they are having an impact on the world for the better. And I think the last few years have been a rude awakening for them in saying, wow, some of these technologies are being abused, or wow, we really have societal problems that we didn't realize. My sense is they're going to want to address that because they really do care about their legacy. And in that type of an environment with that type of leadership, the publicity and collective organizing can make a difference.
Well, we are out of time, but I'd like to end by making a comment on what I hear from what you're saying and what Erik is saying. Here we have a congressman who is representing Silicon Valley and wins by a high percentage of the vote. And he has the ear of entrepreneurs and leaders of technology, and at the same time has an understanding of what workers need and has a compassion for speaking to what workers need. And when we talk about bridging the divide in this country, this is exactly the kind of leadership that we need. Now, that's just to say, keep up the good work, but we have to find a way to take what you're doing and take what we're trying to do in the task force here at MIT and to bridge these divides. And so I think now is an opportunity for all of us to bring business and government and labor and education together, and look forward to your continued leadership in helping us to find a way to do that.
Well, I look forward to your thoughts. We need the expertise that both you, Tom, and Erik bring. And maybe my final comment will be, I'm on the Armed Services Committee, and while I disagree a lot of times with the president's particular policies, I'm amazed when you talk to senior military leaders about the extraordinary competence with which they have gamed out different scenarios. And yet I am flabbergasted that our government doesn't have that kind of thinking about the technology changes in our society. And so we really need much more expertise to help guide us on that.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Ro, and thank you, Erik. Appreciate it.